Welcome to Election Day. Erin and I are here to talk about bezel setting, and bezels are the first thing you want to learn about in the way of stone setting so that you get an understanding of incorporating stones into your project. So I just want to talk a little bit about that. You should look at the handout that I did back before I used a typewriter. That's how long ago it was. What you want to do is choose your stone, and then your stone might have a different height variation, which is going to then make that you have to get a bezel that's the right height. And what you want to do is you want to take your bezel and you want to set it next to your stone, and the bezel should go up past where the stone slopes away. So this is kind of a good example for you guys for looking. So first you choose your stone. So I'm going to use this green stone here, and I'm going to make a bezel with it. And what I'm going to do is, we have different height bezels here, and this is all just plain bezel wire. You can get fancier bezel wire to work with. I'm kind of fond of just the plain bezel wire. But what you want to do is you want to take your bezel wire and you want to put it up next to your stone, and you want to make sure that the stone slopes away from the bezel. This might be a little too tall, but let's look and see if this is a little too short. And it helps if there's a 90-degree angle on it. And I'm thinking that we can get away with the shorter of the bezel. What we don't want to do is cover up the stone too much. So I like to show you guys these two samples that I have here. This is an obsidian snowflake, and the bezel is definitely too tall, so that when I push the bezel over to hold the stone in place, it wrinkles and it covers up so much of the beautiful stone. On the other hand, this is a setting that has a very, very tall stone, and it's going to be held in there, but it's always going to be loose because it's an asymmetrical stone that's on there. What we're looking for is just a really nice clean bezel around, like this carnelian, that shows the stone off the best it can, but it keeps it securely in place. And so when you get your stone, the first thing we'll have to do is find the right height bezel. And then we'll need to come up with a back plate. So what I did with this piece of silver is I cut a disc out that was just slightly wider than the narrowness of this stone. And it was 18 gauge. And I rolled it through the rolling mill to make it become oval. And now it's thinner, but it's going to fit really well as a base plate for my bezel. I have a little bit of extra material around the edge that I can incorporate into the design, or I can take off. So I've done the same thing with this stone here and rolled it out, and that's going to be the bottom plate for this stone here that's on there. So that's kind of a nice little thing to know to do if you've got round or oval stones, is that you can take a thicker piece of silver, roll it through the rolling mill, and get your back plate. The other thing I want to show you is, this is a bezel that's been soldered onto a plate, and then I've cut out the back because I want the light to come through. So that's an opportunity for you. You can also cut a design in the back of it. And I remember a student had a beautiful Montana agate, and it almost looked like an oak tree out in the middle of Wisconsin in the winter. And she cut out the back plate to kind of echo the tree shape, and it just really set the stone alive. So having a back plate and thinking about how to use that is really a nice thing to think about design-wise. Another thing to think about design-wise is you can incorporate your bezel and then solder more material around it. And so this is a zigzag, so kind of to relate us to thinking about this as being a sun. And then this is beaded wire here that I put on here. So what I like to do is I like to make my bezels for my stones, put them on the back plate, and then start thinking about how to incorporate other elements to it. Because I think when you put an edge around the bezel, it makes the bezel feel like it's part of the whole piece and not just stuck on. Whereas this one, for me, it feels like it's sitting on top of a plate. These feel a little bit more integrated into the back plate that's there. And then last but not least, this is something that I bought at a garage sale. It's a beautiful plume agate. I hope no one in my class ever does as poorly craftedness in making it, because first off, the jump ring is not soldered, And then as you go around, you can see exactly where the seam was. And so just like band rings, the bezels need to be where you don't see anything that starts and stops in the seam. But this is what's called a step bezel, and we can talk more about that. I really like you guys not to use a step bezel the first time, just to learn how to do a basic bezel, and then I can help you with a step bezel on that. I was always going to take this stone out and do something much nicer for it because the stone is beautifully cut and the metalwork is crappy, but it's been a really good example over the years. The first stones I want you guys to work with could be round or oval. When you start working with stones that have a sharp angle on them, they become a little bit more difficult to do. But what you should notice here is I put the seam on the long side of the stone, not on the end, because I want these corners all to be the same. And if I had put the seam on the end, that corner wouldn't look the same as the other two. When I'm doing an oval stone, I always put the seam on the long side. It's just easier to do. With a round one, it doesn't make as much difference on there. So what we're gonna do is I'm gonna make just a basic pendant with this green stone. I'm gonna take my bezel, I'm gonna wrap it around, I'm gonna solder the seam closed with hard solder. I'm gonna make it fit the stone well, and then I'm gonna solder it onto this plate. And then I think what I'll do is take a jump ring and just put it on the top so that it can be put on something if I want to make a pendant with it. So in the beginning jewelry class, we want you guys to actually do a bezel set that is then on a stone. And there's two ways that we can do that. I would recommend, if you have the time and the energy, is to just make one that's just on a plate that could be a pendant to wear. Because it gets a little bit more complex when you start thinking about making a bezel on a ring. So this is a moonstone that's irregularly cut, but I decided to use it. I really like the height of it. And so I have made my bezel, soldered it down, and then I used round beaded wire for the outside, and I made that round beaded wire the same way I made the bezel. But I made the bezel first, and then I wrapped the wire around it. I soldered it onto a back plate, and then I went back in and I emphasized the cuts in it. And so now this stone will fit down in it. The whole idea about bezel is your bezel comes up straight, your stone slopes away, and you push the bezel over past 90 degrees and it traps it in place. So this is the one I'm going to make, and I thought, when I make it, how do I want this ring to look? Well, I thought I'm going to take some bronze and I'm going to solder some of that beaded wire on it. And I'm not going to make it a complete ring. I'm going to make it so that the stone setting sits down a little bit lower. And so what I've done now, I've made two parts. I made my bezel and my plate and my beaded wire for decoration. I've made my ring shank. I subtracted this distance off of my length when I figured my band ring out. And then I've now taken and I've filed the bottom so that it sits flat. So what I will be doing for this ring is I'll be turning it upside down. I'll be setting this on the fire brick, and I'll be putting a piece of solder in each place and heating it to get that to connect. So that's one way of making a band ring. I've used hard solder on the band and also on the bezel, so I'm going to use medium solder to put the plate down. I do like to solder it this way because then I don't have to worry about melting my bezel. If I have it upright and I'm trying to solder it, it's going to be more challenging. So we'll see. Those are the parts for that ring there. The other one that I'm making is a little bit more complex, but is something that you should know about. Is I've gotten my bezel material for my stone. I've measured it to make sure that it comes up high enough to hold it in place. I have taken and cut a shape out. It's not quite symmetrical, but I don't know if that's going to matter. And then I've soldered some bronze on here for a color. And then I wanted the silver underneath the moonstone, so I'm going to sweat solder that piece down. So I used hard for the bronze to the silver, and now I'm going to use probably hard again to put this down because it's not going to go anywhere. It's going to lay flat and it's just going to solder down. Then I'm going to make the bezel, and I'm going to solder the bezel onto this after I've made the ring. Because if you solder the bezel down on it while it's flat, when you bend it, the bezel opens up and then it doesn't match your stone. So in this case, this ring has to be made before I put the bezel on it. And I'll be doing that. To show you just how to shape a bezel around a stone, I'm going to take my scissors. I'm going to make sure that I've got a nice flat 90 degrees. I'm going to use my solder snips, and I'm just going to cut it and get it into something that's close to a 90-degree angle. I'm going to set it down here. I'm not sure, is that tall enough?
A little taller.
I think it could be a little taller, but I'm going to go ahead just to show you here. I'm going to start with the seam on the long side. I'm going to hold it down, and I'm literally just wrapping the bezel around. And we can also see that this material is too short. I probably could stretch it, but I also think, can you see that it's not tall enough to hold it? The stone's going to fall out anyway. So I'm going to need to work with some taller bezel. Is this my taller bezel?
Yes.
Okay, so I'm going to do the same thing again. I'm going to save all my little pieces of silver because I can use that later. I'm going to take, once again, I like to hold it just down like this, and I just hold on to it and I wrap it around. When you're working with much smaller stones, we have another way of doing that, and usually we use a mandrel, and I can show you that. I'm going to mark where it overlaps. You can see my little mark. Now I'm going to come in with my scissors, and I'm going to cut as straight a 90-degree angle as I can. Going to set it back down on here, and can you see that I'm a little past it? So I need to trim a little bit more off, which is better than it being too short. My first stone settings that I did were turquoise, and I made my bezel so tight that I actually cracked my turquoise. So be careful when you're doing this. That you want them tight, but that's, see how that's, as I push that around nice and tight, it's just coming up and touching there. So now I think that's going to be an okay bezel, and I've got the height, I think, to hold it in place. So now my trick here is I got to get this soldered together. So I don't care about the shape of the bezel anymore. What I care about is getting these two butt joints, or the two ends, to be a butt joint. So I'm going to push it back and forth across itself and try to line it up, and then I can see what I need to do is take a pair of flat nose pliers, and what I want to do is just take my flat nose pliers and pinch that nice and flat, and then work it again until it just stays in place. Can you see that it's a little bit shorter on one side? The reason for that is this bezel wire started out as a fine silver coin that I rolled through the rolling mill to bring it down to about 28 gauge so that I could then cut strips to make into bezel wire. I don't think that height's going to matter. I'm going to get it soldered, and then I'll sand that bottom flat for it. But now at this point I'm going to be ready to solder it with hard solder. You always have to solder your joint with hard solder. Oh, it's so hard seeing with the mask on and it fogging up with glasses. But I'm not going to care any more about the shape of this. I'm just going to care about these lining up and touching. Should I go ahead and solder this, Aaron?
Sure.
Okay. So I'm going to come over to my fireboard. I'm going to get my flux. And stir up my flux. I'm going to put a little bit of flux on my joint, inside and out. I'm going to set it down on the fireboard. I'm going to take my hard solder, And I'm gonna cut a piece of solder, and the taller the bezel, the bigger your solder chip needs to be, but this looks about the right size. Okay. And I'm gonna come in here. I'm gonna set my piece of solder on the fireboard, and then I'm gonna pick my bezel up and I'm gonna set my seam right on the piece of solder. Okay. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a small flame, and I'm going to heat the back side of the bezel. And as the flux goes clear, I'm going to target the seam, and the solder is going to flow up. The only time that this is different is when you're working with gold. Gold's heavy enough that that piece of solder doesn't want to flow up. So I put the piece of gold solder on top when I'm working with the gold bezel. It's there.
I got it on.
So everybody's going to melt a bezel, but what you just have to remember is not to make too big of a flame. And then you have to remember that we're working with metal that conducts heat, and if I just target the joint, the heat's going to flow away from the joint. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to heat the back side, and I like putting the solder underneath the bezel because then when I heat it up, it's not going to bubble and go somewhere else. But you notice me heating the back. And now that the flux has gone clear, I'm going to go in and out. And I'm going to get that solder to flow. And did you see how I went back in the second time to pull it up? So I use my torch, get it the right temperature, and then I can regulate the heat by going in and out. And if it's not flowing, I go in a little bit more, I back out, I go back in, and I think it flowed, right?
Mm-hmm.
Great. Okay, so you have to use hard solder. You're gonna melt your first bezel and go, well, heck with that, I'm not using hard solder. And then you're gonna run into more of a problem down the line. So when you look at this, can you see that the solder actually didn't flow all the way to the bottom? That's there?
Mm-hmm.
But I'm gonna be filing that off, so I think I'm gonna be okay. What you don't want is a big, huge lump of solder there that you're gonna have to file off. Okay, so I've soldered this, which means it's made it annealed. But remember, bezel wire is fine silver. What I'm going to do now is very carefully just push the bezel over the stone and make sure it's fitting pretty well. And it is. So I need to put this in the pickle. After it comes out of the pickle, I'm going to file off the excess solder. I'm going to take some sandpaper and put the irregular edge, and I'm going to sand it down to make it level. And then we'll be ready to be soldering it onto the plate that's there. Okay, so just remember you got to use hard solder.
Cool.
Does that work? And it fits pretty well around the stone. What I need to do now is I need to file off the excess solder, and I need to sand this to a 400 sandpaper finish, because once I put it on the plate, it's going to be difficult for me to clean up that edge. So do it ahead of time. So what I do is I hold it with my fingers like this, and I take my flat file and I file across until I get rid of the excess solder, and until it looks like the seam is gone.
Sorry, can't find it there.
And then I'm going to take some sandpaper, and I choose to use 400 sandpaper because then I can go into the buffing machine and I can buff off the 400, and then I'm ready to solder it onto the plate. So
Will the sandpaper scratch your stone?
Could, but I'm not going to touch the stone with it. I'm just going to come in right along the edge. And then that looks pretty good. And then the last thing I need to do is remember that bezel wasn't sitting flat, that it had lined up off a little bit like this. So what I want to do now is put it on some sandpaper and sand at least one side flat. And when I get that side down, then I can have a clean surface to solder onto the plate. So I've done it. I haven't fixed the top edge because I can fix that after it gets soldered onto the plate. But what I want to do is make sure that it still fits on the stone, that I haven't changed the shape of it while I was, ooh, that's a little tight. Okay. While I was sanding it, you can change shape on it. So it's sitting pretty good. And then I'm going to want to solder it down onto this here. And this is like a tube set, a tube to a plate that you guys all did with your solder samples. So we need to think about the types of metal. They're both silver, so they're going to heat up the same. Then we think about size. That bezel is going to heat up a lot faster than the plate. And then we need to think about setup, which is if I solder it down on the fireboard, heat rises and all the solder is going to flow onto the bezel. So I'm going to do it up on a tripod. Going to flex it, and I'm going to put 4 small pieces of medium solder on the inside, and we're going to draw the solder out and around the seam there. So I'm going to move over here, and I'm going to put some flux on this, and I'm going to flex the bezel. I'm going to drop it down, and I'm going to make sure that I don't change the shape of that bezel. And then I used hard for the seam on the bezel, so now I need to use medium to solder the bezel down. And then that will allow me to use either medium or easy again when I have to put it onto something. So there we go. And then I'm going to take the solder chips. I'm going to drop them at like 12 o'clock, 6 o'clock. And I'm putting them on the inside so I don't have to worry about cleanup, just like you guys did with the tube to the plate. And I'm gonna, the one is a little bit smaller solder, so I'm gonna put a second piece right there. Come on. Okay. And now I gotta get it back on center. Just where I want it, except that I am a little worried about it not sitting level. So I'm going to bring it into the middle here. Sorry, Aaron. Just keep it sitting. Oh, yes, it is. Thank you.
I see a big light gap.
Thank you for seeing that.
So soon.
I'll blame it on Election Day 2020. Looking better. Sometimes people like to put their bezel just down on a plate and then saw it out afterwards so it doesn't move. And I'm going to do it this way. And then the one thing I'm going to tell you is that 98% of my heat is going to be from underneath. Probably not even going to need to come up to the top. So I'm going to come in and I'm going to dry out the flux, except that I think it's still sitting crooked, isn't it? It's time to flatten this screen. Okay, so I'm going to heat from underneath. And my flux is turning white on the plate as well as the bezel, so that's telling me that I got the right heating. I'm going to keep heating when the flux goes clear. I bet it's going to go clear on the bezel as well. And so what I'm doing is I'm taking the blue cone and I'm following it around underneath, right where the bezel is. And I'm gonna keep heating until the solder starts to flow. And then now that it's flowing, I'm gonna follow it all the way around. And is it flowing over there? There we go.
All the way around.
Got it. So I never came up from the top because the bezel was thin enough to pick up the heat from it sitting on it. And now I can toss it into the water and then into the pickle. And I can chew up the edge a little bit afterwards. It's a little bit bigger over here. I can just file that to make it a little bit more accurate. It's on there. And part of it is it looks like that piece is gone, but it's really that it's just black oxide. So instead of worrying about it, I'm going to throw it in the pickle and then I'll look at it again. So 9 times out of 10, people put the heat up top and they melt their bezel. So just be aware of the two things that go wrong with setting a bezel is not using hard solder on your butt joint for your bezel, and then also not doing all your heating from underneath.